I want to invite now a great colleague. He's an attorney. He's a lecturer at Stanford at the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering. Since the beginning of his involvement with the Peace Engineering Consortium, I always relied on him. We don't talk about finance. We don't connect the finance with policy. And I think that the great contribution of Bruce is connecting the finance policy and how peace engineering can help build also transparency in financial markets. Bruce, I'm cutting short the introduction to give you more time. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Ramiro, for letting me zoom in there, and I hope you all can hear me. I jettisoned the slides today so that I could give you some remarks. As you can see, my head will shake. I have a condition called dystonia. I assure you my head will not pop off. And I am a New York, California, Pennsylvania lawyer. So when and if you say something I disagree with, you'll certainly know it. As we've heard, peace engineering encompasses a broad arc of economic, environmental, political, and social concerns. Taking the SDGs as a starting point and the dire consequences of failing to mitigate climate change by the imminent turning point at 2030, one might ask the engineers in the room and online, what might we do to collectively push the most severe consequences of climate change out a year, a decade, or even forever? We are the leading national elected leaders and laboratories, engineering schools, university departments, and professions. Are we powerless or powerful? Are we meek or mighty agents of change? Whatever those answers, I see dozens of virtual hands raised before their lunch break as I'm speaking right now. The thousands of innovations and projects that will initially and along their maturity occur require various forms of financing in different buckets. So as we've heard from our friends in the national labs, there are grants. For startups, there are friends and family funding that in a small way start for those that win those dollars. Venture capital is good. I'm here in Silicon Valley at Stanford, but the innovator gives up a significant slice of his or her equity stake. Private equity to manage organizations as they grow with seasoned entrepreneurs is essential. But it needs to leverage debt financing to produce market rate returns. And infrastructure and public and institutional finance provide multi-year funding at low rates, lower than most of the above, but often focus on an isolated view of what matters where, what project matters where and when. So how would we develop long-term sustainable finance as a cornerstone of peace engineering? Do you happen to know of any engineering schools with a peace engineering finance major or curriculum? I don't. Sure, our engineering schools have offered courses in project finance, but peace engineering finance would be far more holistic than justifying a decade of funding for a new road, a stadium, a water treatment plant, or the like. I teach ethical and redesigning finance at Stanford, where I simplify how do you explain finance as doing only 4 things and doing them well and responsibly. Financial engineering transforms risk, returns, asset types. In other words, is it a venture capital investment or a bond? And maturity. How long does the capital stay in that form? As a former municipal bond and corporate finance lawyer and banker, I proposed a new periodic table of quality of life elements, or QOLs, to derive a credit rating for peace finance for how any given portfolio of potential government budget outlays or projects better show their transparency and serve to fill gaps and leverage synergies amongst the different benefit streams of existing government obligations. To double down on Joe Hughes' remarks earlier today, and to address Kemo Agi's concerns, I presented these QOL concepts to the National Security Council staffers. So I'm very aware that destabilized markets, that destabilize regions are not good for national security. Let's take a simple example inspired by the COVID pandemic of the last 2 years. Assume that we look at our periodic table for just 4 quality of life QOL elements: health, public safety, education, and economic prosperity. If we invest in a new hospital to treat COVID patients, we have to build it with surge capacity that would need to be repurposed and adapted for non-COVID related case management. If we build high-speed internet broadband available to all community members that serves to give equal access to multi-language health guidance and serves as communications backbone for all 4 quality of life elements: health, public safety, education, and economic development, that would be a diversified investment. But for the broadband to work, the community would need continuous electricity, as George just showed us in Alaska, available especially during peak load and natural disaster scenarios, which, if it existed, would likely reduce the emergency room caseload in the hospital for at-risk but non-severe patients whose concerns and symptoms could be better managed remotely in their homes. And that energy should be supplied by renewable and clean sources. In this simple example, the 4 investments that governments and private sector make in our quality of life portfolio perform individually and in synergy with each other to generate over a 10-year period a greater or reduced risk of gaps in health, public safety, education, literacy, and economic self-sufficiency. In other words, they help each other more than the actual budget for any one of those QOLs. For all of this to work well, data is critical to make these investments happen and to attract the interest of investors. I know of very few governments, city, state, county, or nation, whose budgets aren't in deficit. If their project-based cost-benefit accounting were close to even accurate, the aggregate of all projects authorized with the positive cost-benefit studies that engineers perform should prevail to cure the seasonally and intergenerationally deficit condition of most government budgets. Policymakers' ears seem to perk up when the investment bankers and fund managers' interests in funding government are on the table, and I suggest they are with peace engineering. Peace engineering investments and the data that would feed peace finance could be better tracked by looking at how public budgets are allocated and perform across all quality of life elements as a portfolio of government investments. Do they trend towards addressing individual QOL's high-risk components? If so, financing state and local government bond credit ratings and borrowing capacities would be improved once the credit ratings see this holistic effect on reducing future outlays. With a dashboard that includes government finance metrics, the pricing of individual QOL improvements in any one of the cells, let's say energy, resulting from project interventions improves all interdependent QOL elements. Just like an investment fund manager looks at overall portfolio yield in economic expansions and recessions, rather than over-concentrating investment in one industrial sector, peace engineering finance would provide the holistic measures of accountability. the metrics that engineering uses as measures of progress and professional responsibility, as the dean suggested. Peace engineering can bring new forms of investment and credit ratings tethered to the real economy, as contrasted with the financialized economy that we see on the Bloomberg terminal. Peace engineering as financial engineering comes at a key moment when banks, commodities, and securities regulators are increasingly calling investment fund managers and others to accurately state their claims of sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion, supply chain ethical practices, and so on. I'll take a line from Bernard's script and say, let's seize this moment. Let's be mighty agents of change. And with that, I'll open it to questions if we have time.
Thank you, Bruce.
I'm going to just jump in with one quick comment. For those who have not seen the periodic table that Bruce has come up with, it's probably, I'm just going to say, Bruce, I'm trying to imagine being able to understand your talk without having seen that table. But just go back to the beginning. Bruce said that he had developed a periodic table. It has a lot of these elements of the quality of life. And the way he talked about it that I first saw it was like when it's like periodic table has individual, individual elements in it, right, from physics, but then you can combine those and you get molecules and you get bigger systems. And his periodic table has those kind of elements in it for the different parts and components of peace engineering. When he gave us an example of putting 4 of those together, right? And so the whole concept is from a financial perspective, what happens when you combine these different singular elements into these bigger molecules in peace engineering. And it gives you something that's actually measurable, not only for the engineer, but for the financial community. I felt that wasn't coming through to me, Bruce, in your talk, so I just wanted to jump in there and say that, if that's all right. Hopefully.
Well, I appreciate that. Slides are a powerful help. I just felt, I'm talking to engineers here. You have trust in knowing that the periodic table has been around for over 100 years and is constantly being tweaked, actually due to some of the work in the national labs for measuring what the atomic weights are. And it leaves open at the bottom of the table, in the older tables, the possibility that we haven't discovered a few elements. And so with peace engineering, we probably haven't discovered all the elements. But we know that using the government budgeting processes, however ghastly they are and unpredictable that they are, then each committee on the Hill thinks it has jurisdiction over a particular set of elements, whether it's education, national security, transportation, environment, water, and they measure those elements based on the metrics that engineers give them, or scientists, or doctors. And those metrics, whether they're disability adjusted life years or CO2, those metrics are what are used to justify the investments not only of the federal budget as an investor, but to attract Wall Street and sovereign and other forms of investment in mitigating the effects that were used to justify those budgets. So what I've said in this talk and prior talks is the SDGs don't come with a budget. Last time I checked, the UN doesn't have the budget to fund everybody doing their SDGs. The SDGs are nice, beautiful Pantone colors, but the reality of the color of money that we're talking about is priced according to whatever the government has said it sees as a gap in the need for. That is the price of change. What would it cost the government per 100,000 people to fix the problems in the Navajo Nation or in Cordoba or elsewhere? Okay, that's the price an innovation to address those issues. We will never have enough money appropriated in any of those cells, if you can imagine the cell for health or the cell for environment, to solve the problems and to accelerate the change for those 100,000 per capita people without counting the benefits to the other cells, which is exactly what portfolio theory in finance would do. You wouldn't just invest in, let's say, crypto, to pick on somebody, as a wealth manager. You would invest in a diversity of sectors. Well, let's know that in some days we're going to have a better effect on health by investing in education, because people know how to wash their hands and believe in science. So this is a holistic view, and it comes back to many of the speakers saying we need a holistic view. I'm suggesting money seems to be pretty holistic in the world. It seems to be kind of like Post-its. And so let's use the power of how money is appropriated to justify the interventions and aligning the investments that today has been talking about. That's part of peace engineering, the way Joe has been talking about it, the way Ramiro and Bernard and I have all been talking about it. Peace engineering needs a banker. Let's start to educate and groom those bankers.
What excites you about working together under the Peace Engineering Initiative to advance our respective programs? So,
what really excites me is the possibility that at universities such as our own, the deans of the engineering school, the business school, and some of the other schools might actually break bread with each other monthly to talk about peace engineering. And if you want, I'll treat for the first meal, because it's so unusual for those deans to talk to each other without fighting over potential donors. I think it's a new way for them to talk and find common cause with each other and present a much more holistic view to potential donors, including government grant makers, for why the entire university is marshaling its resources. And I will put a plug in for Stanford. Stanford's announced that it's creating a school for sustainability, but that's not the same as peace engineering. And I think we, by exploring all the different silos on campus and breaking them down, as Ramiro's apt to say, we're going to get there faster. And the students expect us to do that. So let's do it.
So first, I have a question for you on that. When you were saying you're excited about the deans getting together, are you talking about just within Stanford? Or are you thinking that they might get together, between, the different deans? Maybe that's too much to hope for, but the different deans getting together at Stanford, but the different schools within Stanford. But did you also mean like maybe the different universities outside of other deans, other universities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incumbent on these deans.
So is that part of what the Federation is doing? And that there's already an opportunity for doing that? Is that?
Yes, that's
So that's the
correct.
engineering schools, right? So maybe Bruce, what you're suggesting is expanding that federation, hosting something that includes deans from the business school and deans from the other schools.
That's the point that Bruce is trying to make. So we have the Global Engineering Deans Council, and they're talking about peace engineering and other engineering type of related topics. But now we want to open up and start connecting other areas. We said at the beginning, social, techno, policy, finance, we all need to work together now. And this is part of the conversation we will have in November at the annual conference, which is in Madrid. And this is the topic that we'll be presenting with Bruce and other people too.
Yeah, let me give an example. I mean, to my knowledge, there's a directorate at the NSF for economics, and there's a directorate for engineering, and then obviously other directorates. Don't we see after COVID that engineering a supply chain for you know, healthcare and other issues is convergent. And so letting everybody have their the safety zone of their cadre of usual suspect funders isn't going to get us where we need to go. And everybody's going to have to share and come up with actually much more multidisciplinary approaches, such that the markets, as you heard in my talk, can take notice of the science and the engineering progress that is being made. The scientists have been right unto themselves for so long, but the financial, fund managers aren't on the bandwagon in the full force that they need to be. So we need a lot more convergencies and interdependencies on campus, and as you say, between the campuses.
There's a lot of potential areas to apply peace engineering to really get some traction. We want to not just identify interesting problems, but to Bruce's point, where are there some that we can, in the near term, point to some very specific value propositions that people are already interested in putting money behind. And so this is great, but I've been in this field a long time, and I'm not thinking right away of sponsors that are like ready to shell out money for that.
Bankers.
So that's the question. Are there potential sponsors for that kind of work? And just some thoughts from either here in the room or online.
There is an explosion of ESG, environmental social governance, CSR, corporate social responsibility, SRI, impact assessed, supposedly funds and investment vehicles that are coming about. I expect I'll see SPACs and other kinds of nonsense. Ultimately, the regulators, as I mentioned in my talk, are very concerned that there's not the transparency of accountability to see where does the money sit tonight, doing what the fund managers accumulated the funds to do. And so it would behoove us to bring some of our grad students to the DOE and to the Biden administration and say, and the U.S. Treasury and the SEC and the other regulators, the CFTC, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, we need to map the flow of money into those funds to see if they're doing what they say they will do, whether it's by a periodic table or whatever, and in the end, without telling people they were doing peace engineering finance, we will make them do peace engineering finance. So much like you got your kids to eat green, they'll kind of eat green. But it's okay. They don't need to be bothered by the specifics of it. And so let us do what we do, which is it's a data management problem. In this case, it's the data on how funds are flowing and what tags or meta tags are being attached to them and whether they're actually doing what they say they're doing, and informing the regulators that they won't be able to regulate a fund designated ESG, etc., without the work that we're talking about doing.
Any other thoughts, closing comments?
Just one fast one is most of the law firms and most of the investment banks have pro bono commitments to dedicate hours to nonprofits and even universities that behave as nonprofits. And so why don't we ask for them to help us assemble what I was suggesting, which is a continuous, almost like a web page that updates continuously of all of the funds that are being raised in different forms, including internationally, World Bank supported or otherwise, that say that they're going to do ESG and the SDGs, and then map them to the under and over concentration in the periodic table sense of where they're putting too much money into one area without balancing it for the other to achieve the peace. That's
That's
one.
it. That sounds like a very specific, great proposal for,
I,
a call
I
to
would
action.
love DOE to say to my
Yeah,
nonprofit Urban Logic, you know,
yeah,
please do
yeah.
that.
Did I hear George say, please do that, Bruce? I think I did.
You did hear me say please, yes. Of course you heard me always say please. Uh, the other thing that I wanted to interject real fast, George, I'm sorry, is this notion of, and you touched on it, the gaps and the valleys of death. I've been doing some work with AFRL's Sean Ross on readiness levels for innovation and the history of readiness levels, and particularly with regard to the tribal development of readiness levels for innovations and taking action versus the non-tribal senses of when things have to progress through not only TRLs but the other RLs. So I think we need to understand how these different communities hit bottlenecks in readiness levels um, and solve them, or become so dismayed that they won't solve them. And that goes to the implementation issues that we've seen with COVID vax and solar and other areas. So research on readiness level affinities, I think, are key to attract money to break through those bottlenecks.
Thank you, Bruce.